Good morning, my name's Dr Buckman. I'm a GP in Temple Fortune in Golders Green. I live nearby in North Finchley, and on 7th of July 2005 I was the Deputy Chairman of the GPs of the United Kingdom at the British Medical Association. I then went on to be the Chairman, and I've been involved in a lot of politics, but on that day I was on my way to the BMA to chair a meeting. Unknown to me, there was a meeting of surgeons that day, a meeting of GPs having an academic meeting, and I was there to discuss various medical and political matters. And on my way in, at East Finchley, they announced the Northern Line had packed up. There'd been a power surge, and everyone on the train was angry because this has happened repeatedly. The trains weren't going. Now, we didn't know, of course, that 3 bombs had gone off on the underground, but neither did the people at East Finchley. So I got off the train, I went down onto the street, thinking, how on earth am I going to get to this meeting? And I then managed to find a taxi. Whoever finds a black cab when something like that happens, but I did. And the black cab was driving me towards the BMA in Euston. And as I got to Kentish Town, I thought I'd better phone, the traffic looks pretty heavy, I better phone my secretary to say I'm going to be late, tell them to hang on, and I'll start they'll have to possibly start the meeting without me. And while I was on the phone, there was a very loud bang on the phone, and she said, "Oh, there's been a car accident outside." And I thought no more of it. And then when I got to Tavistock Square by taxi, the square was taped off, and there was a policewoman there, and I said, "What's happened?" She said, there's been a problem." Okay, there's been a problem. So I got out of the taxi and I said, "Well, I want to work there. I work at the BMA." And she said, "Ah, why?" I said, "Well, I'm a doctor." And she said, "Oh, good, they need you." And so she walked me past what I thought was a lorry, but it actually was a bus with the top blown off. But I didn't realise it was a bus, and because from the back it didn't look like it. An enormous amount of broken glass, and no birds tweeting. There was also blood on the side of the BMA building, and I didn't realise at the time, but several of the windows had been blown in. And I went through the archway. There's a quadrangle, it's a building shaped like that with an archway. I went through the archway, and as I went through the archway, I said to the policewoman, as one says, "It looks like a bomb's gone off." And I thought that was a sort of semi-joke, but of course it wasn't a joke, and a bomb had gone off. The number 30 bus, which normally didn't go anywhere near Tavistock Square, had been diverted into Tavistock Square, and the 4th of the bombers had blown up his bomb upstairs on the number 30 bus. And that had happened from the time when I was at Kentish Town, and it took 7 minutes to get from Kentish Town to the BMA. So in those 7 minutes, my colleagues had taken old tabletops and old doors and tablecloths and been onto the bus and taken the injured off the bus. And when I got through the archway, the first of many strange coincidences happened, because one of the people waiting for me to chair the meeting was one of my colleagues who was the head, the medical director of the Lincolnshire Air Ambulance, Peter. And he was somebody who had trained his entire life to handle major emergencies. And he goes out with his helicopter, he doesn't fly it, but he goes out in the medical helicopter every week to major emergencies. Usually they're car accidents, but it's all sorts of other things too. And uniquely, Peter, of course, knew what to do. So as I walked through the archway, Peter said, "Oh, glad you're here, you do this one." And there was a woman on the floor. She was quite badly injured, and we had no equipment. The BMA is an office building. It has a first aid kit, but that's useless for dealing with major emergencies. But what the bomber could not have known was that inside that building at that time were many doctors who weren't working. They weren't being doctors, they were there for some other purpose. But of course, when something like that happens, you throw the switch and you go into doctor mode, and so suddenly the place was full of surgeons, and GPs and other people too. And so I knelt down with my patient, and there was a lady with her who was standing up, who'd been a passerby, and at her head was a chef wearing his full chef's kit and his check trousers and his hat. And he was holding her head and talking to her, but she wasn't actually conscious. And so I knelt and started to try and work out what was wrong with her. And it was clear she had no blood pressure. Eventually, one of the ambulance crew brought a blood pressure cuff, and we measured her blood pressure, and it was unmeasurable. That's a bad sign. That means she's bleeding somewhere or something bad has happened. And we got a drip up and started to resuscitate her. And then I looked over the body. How funny, I'd spent 15 minutes with this body and I hadn't looked up. And as I looked up, of course, one of my colleagues, somebody who I'd been a student with, was on the other side of the body, another doctor. And the lady in the coat was now acting as a drip stand. She was holding the bag of fluid up in the air because there was nothing else. And the lady that we were looking after came to a bit, enough to speak. I mean, she couldn't speak very much, but enough to speak. And it was clear that she'd damaged her chest. Almost certainly the pressure of the blast had damaged her rib cage. And there was a question of whether she'd punctured a lung, which is a common blast injury, and what were we going to do? Were we going to get the air out on our knees in the rain on the pavement? And we decided we were not going to do that. It was dangerous. And then over the course of time, the bags of fluid, because we'd started to run out of, we'd drained the bag from every ambulance that had come. Initially there was only one ambulance, but eventually there were quite a few. And all around the courtyard were bodies with doctors looking after them. Some of them were extremely badly injured, some less so. And some of them the surgeons were trying to do things to. Now, to be a surgeon when you've got no equipment whatsoever is quite difficult. And I remember one surgeon tried to stop an artery bleeding by catching the artery between two prongs of a fork because he didn't have anything else. And then we started running out of liquid. And if you run out of intravenous fluid to someone who's got no blood pressure, they're going to die. And my lady lost consciousness again, and it was clear she was probably going to be dead pretty quick. And then suddenly, another coincidence, an enormous policeman appeared. I remember he had a little tiny hat and a relatively small face and an enormous body. He was a motorbike policeman because he had this shiny uniform on. And he came with an armful of bags, and this was the only funny moment the entire day. He said, anyone need any of these? And all the hands shot up. I'll have one of them. Yeah, I'll have one of them. And we obviously, I don't know where he'd come from. I don't know who he was. I don't know who told him to get the bags. Anyway, he did. He obviously had gone, I guess, to UCH, which is round the corner in Warren Street, and he'd gone, raided them, said, I want an armful of bags, and he'd come back with an armful of bags because he saved lives. That guy saved all the people in that courtyard who were going to live. And we put up the drip. My lady recovered sufficiently to get to hospital, and I know she didn't die. So she recovered. And not all the people in the courtyard survived. Most did, but not all. I never saw Miriam. Peter had gone onto the bus with some colleagues to see who needed to come off the bus. And it's a very difficult decision to make, but when someone is clearly either not alive or not going to be alive, and you haven't got enough time and resource to look after everybody, you have at some point to say, we can't do anything. Now, I know, because I've spoken to Peter since, possibly after discussion with the Hymans, that she was actually not alive. I mean, the exact moment of death I don't know, but certainly before I got there. By the time the 7 minutes that took me to get from Kentish Town to Euston, she had passed away. She wasn't the only one who died. There were several people who died on the bus, and there were several other people who died in the courtyard who, in my view, could not have survived. I remember one young man who the surgeon said there was a question of whether we were going to do something quite special for him to see if we could get more fluid into him, and we agreed that he was not going to make it. He was far too badly injured to survive, and he did die in the courtyard. And then when we'd finished By this time, things were happening. By this time, more ambulances had arrived. We'd managed to evacuate some of the people in the courtyard. And I remember, just remembering when we got my lady resuscitated again, and I realised that I was being helped by a fireman. And I said, he was bringing me, we were getting stuff from the ambulance. He was raiding the ambulance for me. And I said to him, aren't you meant to be rescuing people and putting out fires? And he said, well, there's no one else to rescue. And the firemen then acted as spare ambulance men, because obviously the number of ambulance men was nowhere near enough to cope with this. And by this stage, a mobile, it's called a emergency tender, basically a truck full of medical equipment that turns up when there's a really big event. It arrived by that stage. There were 4 tenders, now there's 6 tenders around in Greater London. And the nearest one finally got there. This could well be half an hour to an hour later because of the traffic and because of all sorts of other things. Anyway, they turned up. We then did have enough equipment. We got all of them out, one by one. Peter decided who went first, who was the sickest, who needed surgery. My lady went fairly early because they worried she needed a chest operation. And then we started on the walking wounded. And again, they'd been kept in the hotel next door, being looked after by the chefs in the hotel next door. And the chefs brought them all in, and so did the firemen. And then we started working on all the people who'd been injured, but not so badly. Most of those were blast injuries, people who'd had bits of glass in them. I took out, I don't know how many bits of glass out of some young woman's head. I remember she was 23 and she'd had long hair. We managed to keep most of it and pick out the glass bit by bit by bit. Every single cut, explored it, took out the glass. Then she had to go to hospital to have her head x-rayed. There's a special x-ray you can use to see if glass is in the skin. And so that's what we did. So it was a very strange day. That morning lasted from the time I was at Kentish Town in the taxi until we walked home was 5 or 6 hours. We had to walk because there was no Northern Line. So we walked miles. When we got to Highgate, that's an awful long way from Euston. When we got to Highgate, one of the wives of one of the doctors who was with me came and collected us and took us home. Very strange. And the coincidences are remarkable. Why did the bus go round the corner? Why did the guy blow it up outside a building full of doctors who weren't doctoring? How come there were so many doctors there that day? Unusual, there would never normally be that many, but there were a lot. Far more than you get in any casualty, ever. How come one of the doctors there was a medical director of an air ambulance who knew about emergency management in a way nobody else could have done? The doctoring stuff, any doctor could do. It's like riding a bicycle. Once you know how, you can do it again. But disaster management is not something most of us can do. Peter could do it. How come that policeman turned up with all those bags full of fluid? He saved lives. How come? I don't know how come. He did. And the fact that so many are alive still is a result of luck. I don't know. They all of those things. And the people who died, most of them, I'm pretty sure from looking at what happened to the bus, most of them I would guess died very quickly. And it was a very sad day. And I was invited to say on the television, because I do a lot of television because of my other job. And so I was invited to say, I was asked several times, isn't this all about Muslims? And I said, well, no, actually. These bombers were Muslim, that's true, but it's not all about Muslims. Several of the dead people were Muslims, and this isn't about Muslims, this is about bombers. And it could have been other kind of people bombing, and killing people is wrong, whoever you are, and it isn't about one religion, and I don't think we should characterise it by saying it's this kind of person who does this kind of thing. It's quite wrong to do that. And that actually went away after a while. There was a surge in the media that said we should blame somebody, but actually we shouldn't blame a religion for what a few people do, because most people do not do that and do not think like that and would never do that. And it was not a good day, to put it mildly. It was a very strange day. and I spent the entire evening doing television interviews. I actually did the radio broadcast from the courtyard because Radio 4 phoned me immediately after it and asked me to describe what happened, and I felt I had to describe this as a witness to what had happened, because otherwise people would say it wasn't true, it didn't happen, you're making it up. But actually I saw it, and it was a very difficult day, and so it has been difficult for some families afterwards because of what they've had to go through themselves. It certainly was an experience I don't wish to repeat ever, but I suppose I never will. Thank you.